in the description of the program. She's looking at what have been termed some of the antagonistic discourses that circulated in Miami and, in the Miami media between African Americans and quote unquote white Cubans and quote unquote Black Cubans during the 1980 Mariel Boatlift and the 94 Balsero Crisis. So we're looking to her to help us make some sense of what actually happened there. Many of us are still trying to parse out what really went on. We're going to ask you, and I'm fairly confident that we're going to be able to do this, and that is that to some extent that you manage yourselves during the presentation. And that means that you will keep your microphones muted so that there will be no interruptions. Monika has said she's going to leave time for us so that we are able to ask questions. So for those of you who are familiar with this platform, you'll note at the bottom that you have a raise hand dialogue there. And if you're interested in asking a question afterwards, you can do one of two things. You can do the raise hand dialogue, and I will, of course, call on you and ask you to unmute your microphone. If you're not able to do that and you're having problems, you can use the chat function at the bottom to type your question, and we'll also recognize and acknowledge it there. So without further ado, I turn you over to Monika. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. And I'm so excited to be part of your endeavor to shift the book series to an online format. And I think, as you said, you know, it's really important that we continue to have these conversations. Even in a pandemic, I was reminded of this, of talking with a friend of mine who was talking about how we can really strengthen our resolve to continue to fight against the inequalities that we have going on in our society as we talk and unpack. And this pandemic is really just exposing how bad our inequality is. So I just want to thank you, Joseph Jordan and the Stone Center, the Institute for the Study of the Americas, for creating this space. I also want to thank Sharif Dramé for taking such good care of all the details as we've transitioned from doing the in-person, and now that we have to cancel that, doing this online. And for the audience, given everything that's going on, I'm especially grateful to all of you for joining us today. So bear with me because I have a lot of different screens going on here, trying to get used to this technology as well. So before I get into the specifics of my book, I'd like to set the scene with a reading drawn from the first chapter of the book. And let me see if I can make sure my PowerPoint is going here. Just 1 second. Okay, did that slide go to the next slide for everyone? Did you see that, Joseph? Just want to make sure. Okay, thank you. All right. So in 1990, Miami was set to play host to Nelson Mandela, who had been freed from prison after a 27-year sentence for his role in opposing South African apartheid. During his worldwide speaking tour, he drew staggering crowds and high levels of adulation. Enthusiasm was also high in Miami, Florida, especially among African Americans. Mandela symbolized for them the worldwide Pan-African unity needed to fight against the white apartheid that had characterized the culture not only of South Africa, but also of the United States and of their own city. Yet many Cuban Americans had the exact opposite reaction to Mandela's visit. Before his scheduled appearance, Mandela had given a television interview in which he thanked some controversial friends for their financial and military support. Among these was Cuba's leader, Fidel Castro, the very leader Miami's Cuban exiles had come to the area to escape. Cubans were incensed with Mandela's embrace of Castro, whom they saw as a tyrant guilty of a host of human rights offenses. Their political fight against Castro was their main cause, and they fought with great vigor. As migrants invited to the US because their presence bolstered the US's fight against communism, Cuban Americans primarily saw the US as a land of opportunity to which they owed their thanks. Powerful Cuban American players in Miami's economy acted quickly to mobilize against Mandela's appearance, and the Cuban mayors of Miami and Miami Beach refused to meet with Mandela or bestow any honors. Mandela still made his scheduled appearance, but the red carpet treatment had been rescinded, and his presence was met by 300 or so Cuban protesters. Miami's African Americans, meanwhile, were appalled by this Cuban-led stunt. To them, that Cuban Americans could disparage such a broadly recognized heroic figure of racial justice provided one more example to them of how Cuban Americans, since the beginning of their large-scale migration to the area after 1959, were not only uninterested in their concerns, but actively hostile to their struggle. When city officials supported Mandela's snub, African Americans nationwide launched a boycott of Miami tourism. The boycott ended after the Miami Beach Commission negotiated with African Americans, providing various concessions. And while these moves ended the boycott, the day-to-day tensions between African Americans and Cubans continued to simmer. So even if you're not from Miami, you've likely heard this before, because this Mandela incident is cited by many scholars as one of the most telling examples of the deep divisions that have persisted between African Americans and Cubans in Miami. But my book diverges from previous scholarship by highlighting, as Claire Jean Kim cautions, that we should be careful in narrating conflict between non-Anglo groups in ways that might present white Americans as normative, uninvolved bystanders. Indeed, white elites played a formative role in this conflict as the US prioritized its Cold War fight over local social justice concerns. The Mandela controversy and the specific African-American-Cuban tensions that I explore were compounded by the US history of anti-Black racial practices and foreign policy moves that ultimately served the white power base. So through these chapters in my book, I seek to chart these complex relations between African Americans and Cubans, but also generations of Cuban immigrants. So those who arrived here immediately after Castro came to power, and then those who came later after 1980, as well as Black and white Cubans, with the goal of making visible the workings of white racial power in the shaping of conflict between these groups. My larger argument is that conflict between minority or non-Anglo groups is often rooted in the sometimes unconscious and often strategic embrace of divisive white nativist perspectives. As I will on suggest, the white elite has remapped biological notions of race onto morality-based ideals of worthy citizenship. The idea that the privileges of US belonging must be earned by demonstrating one's worthiness as hardworking, law-abiding, and freedom-loving. I discuss how this dominant framework encourages interethnic conflict when racialized individuals are compelled to claim binary identities such as white versus Black, native versus foreigner, or good versus bad immigrants, as they jockey for status within a system that perpetually questions their claims of belonging. I contend that a closer look at the day-to-day lived experiences of racialized individuals can reveal the multidimensional conditions of meaning-making that are obscured by notions of worthy citizenship. So in my challenge to the antagonistic discourses that circulated, I depict the nuanced ways identities taken to be discrete, such as Black, white, and Cuban, were constructed and negotiated by various actors in the Miami scenario. And I'm in conversation with the few book-length studies that have focused on Miami's native-born African-American communities, such as works by Marvin Dunn or Indy B. Connolly and Chanel Rose's work. And I add to the scholarship on the post-1959 Cuban diaspora and to the story of Miami race relations by bringing in voices of Afro-Cuban immigrants, who until Alan Aha's work and a few others have been virtually ignored in social scientific analyses of the post-1959 Cuban American experience. While the Miami context is unique, I seek to connect the findings of the historical cases I explore to modern debates within the scholarship on race and immigration, African American studies, Latinx and critical Latinx whiteness studies, and Afro-Latinx studies. And I really found that engaging and intervening in all these various literatures was crucial to unpacking the racial dynamics that I explore. I also bring together two realms of study that are largely kept separate. One, the first emphasizing the Black-white or white-non-white divide, and the second focusing on the assimilation processes of immigrants of color, to really capture the messiness of modern race relations. These two realms of study need to be brought together to help us understand, for instance, the dynamics of contest over power and resources in majority-minority contexts, such as Miami, and the contests that take place not just between non-whites and the Anglo population, but also between groups of color. Having grown up in Southern California in such majority-minority spaces, these were the sort of questions I was intrigued with and wanted to engage. And I felt Miami is a particularly salient place to examine these questions with its early history as a Southern town that maintained a strict separation between white and Black, with Jim Crow segregation, the KKK, and white on Black violence. And as the area transformed, conflict between whites and Blacks continued, but also began to intersect with the racial tensions of the future as the area received large numbers of new immigrants, especially Cubans, who came to be the majority of residents. So I wanted to look closely at these intersecting racial dynamics to analyze how the social devaluation of Blackness, for instance, continues to shape contemporary race relations for both native-born African Americans and newer immigrants. So I accessed African American and Cuban American voices through a study of African American and Spanish language newspapers, the Miami Times and El Nuevo Herald, respectively. And I read the papers to examine how members of these groups documented the drama that unfolded during the 1980 Mariel Boatlift and the 1994 Balsero Crisis. These were two of the most controversial waves of Cuban immigration. Through an analysis of these papers, which I can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A, and in-depth interviews, I foreground the Afro-Cuban presence that began to grow after 1980, from about 3% of the previous waves of Cuban immigration to anywhere between 15 and 40% of the Mariel refugee population. Their presence and their voices complicate the strict divisions that were imagined between African Americans, Cubans, and other populations in Miami. So that's an overview. So now I'd like to draw from my chapters on Mariel to provide just a few examples on how various notions of Blackness, seen here, function symbolically to create as well as disrupt boundaries between the communities on which I focused as they negotiated their multifaceted identities. So let's start with constructions of Blackness, criminality during Mariel. So the Mariel Boatlift has received much scholarly attention since 1980, and it continues to have scholarly relevance. I just learned, for instance, that the University of Miami is kicking off a year-long program to commemorate the 40-year anniversary of Mariel. And one reason that it was so significant for Cuban Americans was because it revealed the precariousness of their favored status. As Isabel Molina Guzman points out, Cubans have benefited from implicit racial privilege in ways that many other Latino groups have not, due to their being regarded as upwardly mobile anti-communist heroes. But after Mariel, public opinion began to shift, in part because while previous waves had been invited by the US, the Castro government sent the poorer newcomers, who came to be known as the Marielitos, and they arrived in overwhelming numbers. Much previous scholarship has focused on how they were continuously portrayed in the media as criminals and as a drain on US society, and this was in great contrast to the ways that earlier waves have been depicted. But while this scholarship makes passing reference to the idea that the criminal stigma was intensified by the fact that so many of the newcomers were Black, in general, the stigma attached to Blackness is taken for granted in these discussions. So rather than take Black stigma as a given, I sought to plot out how language around Blackness helped to produce the Mariel stigma. And what I found particularly intriguing in the news reporting in El Nuevo Herald was that the blackening of the Marielitos, the majority of whom, remember, were actually white, was not simply in the biological sense, but in associations that were being made between them and African Americans. El Nuevo Herald amplified both mainstream voices and stories that were translated from the English language Miami Herald, and Cuban American voices that came through in op-eds, letters to the editor, and feature stories. Now, the paper rarely described the Marielitos explicitly as Black, but characterized them with surrogates for Blackness, such as the word ghetto. For instance, an editorial employed this word to contrast the Mariel immigrants with the previous waves. It reads, "This isn't the working class that moved in 15 years ago and converted a declining community into a bustling commercial district. These men are the building blocks from which a true Cuban ghetto can emerge, with all the problems that that word implies." The editorial suggests we know the problems that the word ghetto implies, without actually filling in the blank for us. But the op-ed and other articles make a strong statement against the peculiarity of Cubans being characterized as deviant and living in conditions similar to those of African American ghettos, thus preserving the good image of the Cuban American community. Now, one thing to note is that the US was quite unprepared for the large numbers of refugees who came during Mariel, so they were being held in camps and in tent cities while they awaited processing and sponsors. And Black Cubans were least likely to find sponsors, so they often languished in these camps and these tent cities. So in a report about the condition of these camps, the word ghetto is also employed, linking the Mariel refugees to African Americans. The report focuses on a fight between refugees in the camps and the police, and quotes a threat made by a Cuban upset with his treatment. The report reads, quote, "The American Blacks set this zone on fire, causing $200 million in damage," yelled a refugee. "We have more guts than they do, and we're going to set this place on fire," unquote. The writer is referring here to the Mcduffie Riot, which had occurred just a month before Mariel began. And this uprising was a response to the police beating and killing of Arthur Mcduffie, an unarmed Black man, after which all the police officers were acquitted. A very familiar story. With references to rioting African Americans, the reporting makes US Blacks into instigators of the problem, models of deviant behavior. Although the news article calls attention to the failures of the local and federal government, the ultimate message that was that the real problem in the tents and the real threat to the local community was the Marielitos themselves. So in chapter 2 of the book, I captured Cuban American reactions to the blackening of their incoming compatriots as found in El Nuevo Herald. Their first impulse definitely was to defend their compatriots. But there were also examples that revealed that distancing themselves from Blackness or notions of criminality by distinguishing the good Mariels from the bad or criminal ones became a primary tool for reclaiming Cuban whiteness and their former favorite status in the US. As Antonio Lopez, Ramon Grosfugel, and others point out, not viewed as true whites by Anglo whites, Cubans who are white in Cuba have to work to reclaim whiteness in the US. Toni Morrison and others similarly suggest that distancing from Blackness is a key way for many immigrants to approximate whiteness and its privileges. Such anti-Black racism is, of course, not to be excused. But in my analysis, what I'm seeking to do is to complicate notions that Cubans are simply racist on the individual level, highlighting the role of US state intervention in their quest for whiteness, as the US power elite, in essence, required them to continually demonstrate that they remained worthy anti-communist heroes. US-based discourses circulating in the media by neoconservative groups in the 1980s had defined the social problems affecting the United States in moral and racial terms, using African Americans especially as scapegoats. So these discourses about African American pathology would heighten any anti-Black notions already held among some Cuban exiles brought with them from Cuba, and were drawn upon by some to dissociate from their criminal compatriots. So let's move to the next topic. My interviews with Black Cubans who arrived during Mariel suggest that the Black versus white frame in turn shaped not only how established Cubans related to African Americans, but also how they treated Black Cubans, who were often left out of Cuban American idealizations of Cuban unity that was so important in constructing the notion of the good immigrant as worthy citizen. Interviewees who arrived during Mariel, they talked about being rejected by fellow Cubans because they were Black during that time. And they also described being looked down upon by some white Cubans in Miami even today. Several spoke of what they saw as a particularly annoying manifestation of white Cuban dismissals. White Cubans would often assume they were African American or from a different, i.e. Blacker part of the Caribbean. True, Miami's Black population is extremely diverse, but the respondents were frustrated that people would never even consider that they could also be Cuban, as expressed here by Carlos, who arrived in the US in the 1980s. He says, in Cuba, there are towns that are 90% Black. There are whole towns, and so for the love of God, he theorized that the white Cubans he encounters actually do know Black Cubans exist, but want to deny them. He says it's a matter of denial or lack of will to acknowledge these things. In Catholicism, there is a type of precondition for sinfulness called culpable ignorance. And this is when someone makes up their minds and believes, I don't want to know. Antonio Lopez's analysis of white middle-class Cuban American accounts of their return to the island offers some insights into this, explaining this culpable ignorance. So Lopez describes the Cuban Americans' surprise at finding their previously owned homes now occupied by Afro-Cubans. And these white middle-class Cuban American narratives elucidate a belief that the proper place for Blacks was in the background of the lives of the rightful white owners. The narratives expose a deeply held belief that the post-revolutionary Cuban national house is in shambles, in part due to it now being occupied by Blacks who cannot properly care for it. So when I talked with people, Black Cubans in Miami, and asked them, why they believe some white Cubans in Miami display racist sentiments, they presented some thoughtful analyses about how racial notions from Cuba's slaveholding and colonial past intersect with the dominant racial ideologies of the US. For instance, Mariela offers this argument. Just 1 second here, make sure there we go. I think that many of them, white Cubans in Miami, have old prejudice and patterns that people from the exile community have in their mind. And then what happens is, do what the Romans do. And it reinforces what they had a long time ago in their minds. Mariela's assertion was a view also held by several other interviewees. So there was this idea that Miami Cubans have adopted US American values and have become more similar to white Anglos than to Cubans of all colors on the island. In this way, they situate Cuban American whiteness within a specific context related to the United States history of anti-Black racism and its anti-communist and imperialist goals. Now, the distinctions that they make between Cubans on the island and in the United States arguably require more nuance to capture how white racism indeed continues to prevail in present-day Cuba. But still, as the respondents reclaimed and affirmed their Cuban identity from those who seem to revoke this identity from them, the distinctions that they make highlight how national contexts intervene in the racialized experiences of Afro-Cuban immigrants and how the US context works to heighten white Cuban racism. So let's talk a little bit about Blackness as a political position. And I'd like to turn to the African-American perspective during Mariel. And this is something that I unpack in chapter 3. So for members of the African-American community, they faced a dual dilemma as they grappled with how immigration and the US's greater diversity would change their conceptualizations of Blackness and their political position. And as I was mentioning earlier, Mariel came on the heels of a major African-American uprising. And Mariel mattered for African-Americans because they believed local politicians would shift their focus onto a new wave of Cubans and lose sight of the continued subjugation of Blacks. So we had new immigrants entering the Miami area in 1980, and this included not only the Mariel Cubans, but also a large number of Haitians. And as they were coming in, African-Americans addressed their concerns in the Miami Times Weekly, which is Miami's leading African-American newspaper since 1929. So they were seeking to address these problems that they were experiencing, which some actually blamed on immigration. But while doing so, they also struggled to uphold the closely held ideals of the civil rights movement, which would mean defending all marginalized groups and connecting their struggles to Black struggles. Yet, the disparities in white-centric US immigration policy created a situation in which Cubans and Haitians were pitted against one another in the reality of many African Americans in Miami. So we know that Cubans had historically been classified by the US government as refugees seeking asylum, but Haitians who were also fleeing a dictator at the time were generally sent back or held in Guantanamo. So we saw in the newspaper these editorials and op-eds that challenged what African Americans perceived to be this anti-Blackness as it manifests in US foreign policy. For example, an op editorial that ran during the same month that Mariel begins with a statement. It says, "The immigration policies of this nation are prejudicial and anti-Black. On the other side of the immigration coin, while the Cubans were demonstrating, the lowly Black Haitian refugees were in federal court fighting deportation, fighting for survival and the right to remain in this country as political refugees, just like the Cubans." An op editorial written by the prominent Black leader Vernon Jordan similarly asserts that race was most likely the reason for the differential treatment of Haitians. That's the second part of that quote there. So here's the one from Vernon Jordan. So it says, while immigration authorities implemented a deportation plan for Haitians, there was no such plan to deport Asians or Cubans as a deterrent. Why? It's hard to escape the conclusion that race is a factor. Many white Americans may harbor prejudice against Asians and Hispanic people, but those feelings flower into brazen racism when they are confronted with Blacks. So Jordan speaks to this hierarchy that was perceived among a lot of African Americans that was shown in the Times newspaper. He speaks of a hierarchy among racialized groups, arguing that anti-Black racism was more blatant than that experienced by other minorities. This piece, like many of the other editorials and news stories, pit Black oppressed brothers and sisters against other immigrants, particularly Cubans or quote unquote foreign whites. Other stories portraying voices from the community were even more stark. There were other stories that, or other letters to the editor that were supporting anti-bilingualism. There was an anti-bilingualism measure circulating at the time. So some of them were supporting that. And there were also op-eds and letters to the editor with people saying Cubans should go back to where they came from. So the binary frames that were used to characterize white Cubans and Black Haitians simplified this greater complexity of a Cold War climate in which immigration and refugee policies were actually consistent with policy moves to reverse civil rights movement gains. And so what we would see going on is that African Americans would draw upon Pan-African idealism to embrace Haitian newcomers, but Black versus white and Native versus foreigner ideologies would have a powerful force that ironically constrained an African American embrace of Cuban migrants. I argue in this chapter that a closer look at the African American position reveals their desires to challenge more fully the persistence of anti-Blackness in the US. But I also critique the zero-sum reasoning we can see here. Still, the primary aim of this chapter and of the book as a whole is to emphasize the role of white elites in creating the conditions for the oppositions that occur between minoritized groups, resisting the move to explain away the African American response as simply, quote unquote, African Americans doing to immigrants what whites did to them. Now, the final topic we'll talk about a little bit here and then open for questions is this idea of Afro-Cuban multiplicity as Black resistance. So in my chapters on Mariel and also on the Balsero Crisis, which would happen 14 years later, we could see ways that Cuban Americans and African Americans at times adopted binary racial notions that negated the complexity of the race and identity negotiations that we've been discussing. And moreover, the adoption of these simplified racial notions served to render Black Cubans invisible. So I thought it was very important to focus on the instances when Black Cubans were discussed in the newspapers, and I interspersed their testimonials from the interviewees into each of the chapters to highlight the ways that their presence forced white Cubans in Miami to acknowledge and contend with their own Blackness, challenging those who sought to dissociate themselves from African American Blackness in their quest for American belonging. The greater presence of Black Cubans also forced African Americans to revise their understandings about what exactly it means to be Black and challenge the African American framing of Cubans as quote unquote whites and as foreigners, forever divided from native-born African Americans. Now, Cubans complicate this idea of race alone being a factor in creating any political bonds because, of course, in reality, Cubans are white, Black, and mixed. And in my final chapter, I delve deeper into the resistive potential of Afro-Cuban multiplicity and in-betweenness. And I argue that this resistive potential diverges, however, from Latin American idealizations of mestizaje or racial mixture, and also diverges from US ideals of colorblindness as solutions or endpoints of racial power. Rather, I argue that the Afro-Cuban informants in my book draw upon their complex positionalities in ways that subvert the policing of ethnic racial boundaries, revealing the tenacity and multiplicity of trans-American anti-Blackness and challenging the racial politics of division as it operates in the United States. So I'll end with just one example on this topic. And this is from my interview of Charlie, who came to the US during Mariel as a child and grew up mostly in Miami. While interviewees displayed a range of emotions about how they felt when people from various groups questioned them about their identities, which was a common occurrence, and you know, when they were questioning them, it was with the suggestion that they do not fully belong. Charlie draws upon his in-between positionality to have a bit of fun at the expense of, for example, white Cubans who might question his Cubanness. So his questions don't faze him, he says. He says, no, I just feel good because I'm more of a chameleon. It's good that you don't know what's going on in here. You know what I mean? Like, put it this way, it's smarter for me to know what's going on with my identity and to make other people think that they know what's going on. But in reality, I really do. So in so many words, Charlie is expressing this pleasure of possessing a multiple or Afro-Latinx triple consciousness that the late Juan Flores and Miriam Jimenez Roman argue allows for this embracing and celebrating of all the dimensions of oneself. So he emphasizes that by playing the chameleon, he can blend into various identities, which allow him to be one step ahead of the people that he encounters on a daily basis. By playing along with people's assumptions, he inverts a hierarchy, establishing the idea that he is the one who is actually more knowledgeable about who he is and about who others are. So he can challenge those who make themselves into the arbiters of proper Cuban identity. The Afro-Cuban critique of race in the United States not only provides important insights of it for advancing a critical study of Cuban and other Latinx anti-Blackness, but it also offers a challenge to African Americans who place limits on who qualifies as Black. And the interviewees told several stories also about not always being embraced by African Americans. And so the folks I interviewed, they conceived of themselves as being part of a wider diaspora, but what was very clear was that they subverted the expected homogeneity of Black cultures and experiences, decisively making claims to the distinctiveness of a Cuban Black identity. All in all, the identity negotiations of these individuals illuminate the fallacy of racial binaries and exclusionary politics that is promoted by the mainstream and embraced by various groups. And they make even more clear what Jimenez Roman and Flores argue, quote, are the increased complexities of the color line in light of the transnational nature of present day social experience, unquote. So thank you again. I'll end here and take questions, open up for discussion.
Okay, you can't hear all of the hands clapping, but there are people at home clapping for you.
I can hear you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure. Let me reiterate for folks that are online with us, you can raise your hand and we'll find your hand and recognize you. Or if you prefer, you can write it in a chat and I will pick it up. And I have several that have come in already. First of all, fantastic paper, thank you. And many hand clapping emojis, so you get those. But you have a question from Perlita, and it's thank you for your important work. And they're wondering if you have a sense of how COVID-19 might underscore or contrast with the conclusions you draw about Black Cuban racial positionality.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely, that's one of the things I was referring to at the beginning of the talk about how COVID-19 is really making very clear the problems in our society and the inequalities that exist, showing, for example, you see reports about how Black people, they're not taken as seriously when they go to try to get diagnosed. They're more likely to die from the illness. Also, you see the issues that are going on Native American reservations. There's a lot of things going on with COVID-19 that makes it all the more clear that we need to continue to address these inequalities. We need to realize that the pandemic is only shining a light on this. And I think that in terms of some of the other arguments I have about, the moral ideas about worthiness, I could see things going a lot of different ways with COVID-19, where people start policing people you know, because of particular ideas about, you know, how people should behave. So, you know, I find it quite concerning. I'm definitely keeping my eye on what's going to go on with that.
Okay. All right, we have a question from Professor Berry. Mike, can you unmute yourself? There you are.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. I was so excited to hear about it happening, and I'm glad that it's still able to happen virtually. I'm adopting it for a new course I'm creating on Black Caribbeans in the US, focusing on Afro-Latinos in particular. And my question is really coming from an excitement that I see the book is taking on. It's a thread that I try to bring into my course about how can it be white elites or white political projects really try to enhance or create divisions amongst folks that otherwise could recognize their shared interests, whether it's class and interests or otherwise. And so part of the project is to keep people that actually have an investment in each other's futures to see themselves as separate and in competition with one another. And I see this as one of the arguments that your book is taking on. And then I'm also looking about this in relationship to the case of kind of the way that the power elites in Chicago, for instance, also tried to do this with dividing, you know, each neighborhood being a different ethnic group, but then we saw the Rainbow Coalition come out of that, and kind of these incredible political organization that was able to see past these divisions and work together in solidarity. Of course, they were squashed by COINTELPRO, but do we see in this Mariel case or in Miami glimmers of hope of a political imaginary that was able to kind of overcome this? And is there a legacy of that today?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. So one of the things that was really interesting to see was there's a struggle going on with this. So like I was saying, with African Americans, there was this idea of the civil rights movement impetus to bond with other people who are also marginalized that they wanted to continue to hold on to. So you have, especially Black leaders, like the newspaper had would run a syndicated column from Jesse Jackson and some other Black leaders. And those Black leaders were often saying exactly really what my book is arguing, you know, pointing out that the larger power base is doing a divide and conquer, and we need to overcome this. So one of the good things is that, you know, even though it is true that the tone of these newspapers was more negative towards Cubans, like you're talking about the African American newspaper, that there were counter voices in there, and so there was a tension there. And so we have people trying to work with these tensions. And also in the Spanish language newspaper, when I moved into 1994, when the newspaper that I'm looking at was more, had become more Cuban. Before it was kind of like, it had more a mixture of Anglo and Cuban voices at the same time. You can see ways that they were recognizing how they were not being favored anymore and were being treated just like other immigrants, and starting to analyze what does that mean, trying to point out you know, some of the ways Haitians and Cubans should kind of come together based on similar needs. So you definitely see different voices in regards to what's going on there.
Thank you.
Thank you, too. I think everyone can see the question from Mr. Perez, who first congratulates you. But he's asking whether you see your research either expanding, and I'm assuming he means, could it possibly be expanded? But also, do you also see it referring to or having the same or similar dynamics in this tri-state area centered around New York City, I guess with the same populations and communities there?
Yeah, I think New York has a very different dynamic. You know, definitely in New York, there was Black Cubans who had gone there at earlier points in time, were able to bond with other Black people, and there was, they had a whole different reception there, where they were able to kind of create this community, which really contrasts from in Miami, where they felt this rejection. And so there's a different thing going on there. But one of the things that I would say, though, is that the larger idea of the book is thinking about how these kind of binary notions of identity and worthiness are adopted by various groups. So in other spaces, such as, Southern California, where I'm from, where you might see Latinx folks and African Americans having some tensions with each other, the basis for those tensions might be somewhat similar to what we saw going on in Miami, where African Americans are seeing Latinx folks as foreigners who are taking over our space, taking over our jobs, those kinds of things. And you will see anti-Black prejudice in various different Latinx groups. And so I definitely think that this is a story that is very unique in the way that it plays out in Miami, but also we can see it in other places as well. And I did want to put a caveat that, we know that interethnic tension is not the whole story. We have so much work out there about how Blacks and Latinx folks, for example, bond together for many different causes. But I really wanted to focus in on these types of problems and kind of unpack these, because I think it's important to prepare for, the problems that could possibly happen, as well as celebrate the ways that we do come together.
Okay, for Ana Cecilia, I think you should be unmuted if you want to ask your question.
Exactly. Okay.
I can hear you.
Go right ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I want to congratulate you, first of all, for the clarity and the depth of your paper, Monika, on disentangling a very complex issue. And of course, my question has to do with language and the role that that plays, especially this reclaiming worthiness, reclaiming whiteness, both on the part of the African American community in Miami and the Cuban white community, because their links to English and Spanish could in fact favor the African American community, saying, look, at least we talk the master's language, and using that as another way to distance themselves from the. On the other hand, the Cubans seem to have maintained a very strong alliance with Spanish in Miami, despite this, overburden, and to have, for example, the first and best bilingual education programs in the United States. So I'm wondering how language played a role in, especially since the white elite power is constantly pushing.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. I didn't hear some little parts, but hopefully I got most of it. So language was very important. And one of the things I mentioned was that there was an anti-bilingualism proposal circulating around the time that Mariel was happening, and it actually passed at that point in time. And so this anti-bilingualism proposal, what was interesting to see in the newspaper was how African Americans were some of them were saying we should support it, because one of the things that they were seeing, for example, is that in Miami, back in the olden days with segregation, Black people were the maids in the hotels and things like that. Black people were the ones who had to leave from colored town, go to Miami Beach and work in the hotels. And now the hotels were being owned by Latinx folks who wanted Spanish speakers. And so they were saying, we can't get jobs now because they want Spanish speakers. So, that was one of the complaints that they had. But also you would see comments such as, like there was one op editorial, I think it was not an op editorial, but it was a letter to the editor, and it said something like, Cubans shouldn't come to someone else's house and start rearranging the furniture. They should learn English, And so you hear that same type of kind of nativist idea around language. which was kind of ironic because they were very supportive of the Haitians who also spoke a different language, but didn't speak about their language in the same way. So you definitely saw that going on. But going to, I think what you were asking the second question with Cubans, there's something that I think it's Alan Aja talks about this, how there's this idea of Spanish language being kind of taken as it belongs to one group. So it belongs to the Cubans, but not to others. So this assumption that if a Black person can't speak Spanish, so Black Cubans would be upset because the assumption that Blackface means you can't speak Spanish. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in regards to language.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question. I'm going to ask Alberto, if you can hear me, that we didn't get all of your questions. So if there's any more to your question, please finish. You have a question from Mike Levine, I think it is. Do you feel that there are characterizations of the Cuban community in areas like Little Havana and Hialeah that either diminish or marginalize the contribution of Miami's Afro-Cuban community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you know, one thing I would say as a whole, you know, one of the main reasons why I was so interested and I thought it was so important to bring in Afro-Cuban voices in regards to Miami was because in general, when you look at scholarship or a lot of different spaces, Afro-Cubans are kind of relegated to the space of the cultural, you know, so people will talk about Afro-Cuban music and dance, and they'll talk about different contributions, but leave it in a cultural space, rather than engaging with the ideas that Afro-Cubans have, the political perspectives of Afro-Cubans. And I thought that, and that's definitely the way that the Miami Cuban community is kind of painted with this broad brush, that they all think the same, that they all have the same political orientation. And while there might be one particular orientation which is predominant, there is a lot of diversity, especially if you look at you know, different generations and things like that. So this was one of the reasons why I really wanted to bring in Afro-Cubans as political subjects, as people who have a voice in terms of what's going on in the larger racial structure that's going on in Miami.
Okay. I'm going to go back to a couple of comments, one from Mr. Perez to the group, and an enduring sore point to this day for many African Americans in Miami is the insistence of being bilingual and how it's perceived as a pretext for color-based hiring in Dade County. So I guess he's agreeing with some of what you said. From Dr. Jennifer Gurres-Escandon here, thank you for sharing your research, Dr. Gosin. It validates aspect of my lived experience in Miami as a graduate student years ago. I look forward to introducing my family to your book. Got one sale, okay? So, and then this is also from Alberto Jones. To everyone, I hope to come, much effort has been made in Miami to dilute and erase the blatant racism that led to the creation of the term Marielitos to equate with criminality. May COVID-19 help both Afro-American and Afro-Cubans apply lessons learned and work together to advance our common cause and to take advantage of the strengths of either community. Thanks so very much for your work.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, are there any other questions that I may have missed? I don't see any other hands up and no more questions here. If not, we're just about at a finishing hour. I want to thank folks for sticking in, signing on, sticking in, and keeping up with us. Is there a way that if folks want to continue the conversation with you, Monika, is there something that you'd like us to handle from here, or would you like to do it directly?
Sure, they can contact me directly. They can, I think maybe we'll let them come to you for my information, perhaps, even if they can't just find it themselves, and then they can feel free to shoot me an email. Yeah.
Okay, well, however, I got one last question. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, it says, how do wealthy Latin Americans fit in? Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether they mean, do they fit into your research or do they fit into the situation?
Well, One thing I will say is that the book is talking about, you know, a historical period looking back at 1980, 1994. But since that time, Miami has changed quite a bit. You know, I do, in my later chapters, I do talk to Afro-Cubans about their experiences, you know, in the present. But even since that time, it has changed. And so we do have a lot more Latin Americans coming into Miami who are wealthier and also are more whiter, let's say. People are doing research on that and work on that, and how these kind of interesting inequalities between white and Black are happening, but with the foreign-born population. So we might have foreign-born Latinx folks who are wealthier versus other groups, whether it might be Caribbean, you know, people from the Caribbean, Black people from the Caribbean, or other poor Latinx folks. So it's interesting seeing how these dynamics are shifting and exploring what that's going to look like in the future. So maybe that's what the questioner was thinking about, these new arrivals of wealthier Latinx folks within recent years.
All right. All right. Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to all who came on with us. If you do have a further question, please send it on to us, and we will make sure that it gets to Monika. Can you say one last word about the publisher of the book and where people can, I know they can get it at all Populars.
Sure, yeah, if you were interested in it, I definitely appreciate you going directly to Cornell University Press's website and getting it from them directly would be, I'd appreciate that, of course. But yes, it's Cornell University Press, and it was published just last year, 2019.
All right. All right. Thanks again to everyone. Please travel safely. Continue to social distance, but stay in touch. All right.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Joseph Jordan. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
And to Sharif and Stephanie and the rest of the staff, and
That's
to
right.
the staff of Issa, Beatrice, Lou, and all who were very, very helpful in making sure this happened. Take care.
Thank you so much to all of you.
All right.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Monika. Thanks.